The morning mist hung low over the grounds of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall windows of her private study, watching the first rays of sunlight pierce through the London fog. Her fingers traced the edge of a handwritten letter that had arrived just hours before, its contents weighing heavily on her mind. The elegant script belonged to William, though the words within carried a gravity she had rarely seen from her husband, even in their most challenging moments as senior members of the royal family. In the letter, William had detailed his thoughts about a decision that would reshape not only their roles within the monarchy, but also their relationship with the British people. It was a decision born from months of quiet contemplation, private discussions held in the sanctuary of their Norfolk home, and careful consideration of what their legacy should truly represent. The letter spoke of duty, yes, but also of authenticity, of the responsibility they felt to bridge the gap between tradition and the evolving needs of a modern nation. Catherine folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her mahogany desk, the same desk that had once belonged to Princess Diana. The symbolism was not lost on her. Like Diana before her, Catherine understood that true royal influence came not from grand gestures or elaborate ceremonies, but from genuine connection with people who looked to the monarchy for guidance, comfort, and hope during uncertain times. The decision they were preparing to announce would surprise many. It was not about stepping back from royal duties, as some had speculated in recent weeks when they had been notably absent from several high-profile events. Instead, it was about stepping forward in a way that would challenge centuries of royal protocol while honoring the essence of what the monarchy had always meant to represent: service above self. As Catherine made her way through the palace corridors, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The past year had been particularly challenging for the royal family. The nation had faced economic uncertainty, social divisions had deepened, and many young people had begun to question the relevance of monarchy in their daily lives. Traditional royal engagements, while well-intentioned, seemed increasingly disconnected from the real struggles that ordinary families were facing. It was during a private visit to a food bank in Manchester that Catherine had experienced what she would later describe to William as her moment of clarity. She had been speaking with Sarah, a single mother of 3, who had been made redundant from her job at a local manufacturing plant. Sarah had thanked Catherine for her visit, but then asked a question that would haunt the princess for weeks. What happens after you leave? When the cameras are gone and the officials move on to the next event, what changes for us? The question had exposed a fundamental disconnect that Catherine knew needed to be addressed. Royal visits, however well-meaning, often felt like brief moments of attention that ultimately changed very little for the people they were meant to serve. Catherine shared this conversation with William that evening, and it sparked a series of discussions that would eventually lead to the decision outlined in his letter. William had his own catalytic moment during a visit to a homeless shelter in Birmingham. He had spent hours talking with residents, learning about their stories, understanding the complex web of circumstances that had led them to seek shelter. One young man, barely 18, had lost his parents in a car accident and aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go. The boy's resilience impressed William, but his story highlighted systemic issues that required more than occasional royal attention. "I want to do more than just visit," William had confided to Catherine later. "I want to actually solve problems, not just witness them." This desire to move beyond symbolic gestures had led them to develop what they privately called the Windsor Initiative, though the public would come to know it by a different name. The initiative represented a fundamental shift in how they approached their royal duties, moving from ceremonial roles to active problem-solving positions within British society. The plan was ambitious and unconventional. Rather than maintaining the traditional distance that royal protocol typically required, William and Catherine would embed themselves directly within communities facing the most pressing challenges. They would not arrive with fanfare and depart the same day. Instead, they would establish temporary residences in different regions of the UK, spending weeks at a time living and working alongside local residents, business owners, community leaders, and social workers. The legal and constitutional implications had required months of careful navigation with palace officials, government representatives, and constitutional experts. The Queen had initially expressed reservations about such a dramatic departure from established protocol, but she ultimately gave her blessing after William presented a detailed proposal outlining how the initiative would strengthen rather than diminish the monarchy's connection to the people. Catherine's role in developing the initiative had been crucial. Her background in art history had trained her to see patterns and connections that others might miss, and she applied this analytical skill to understanding the interconnected nature of social problems. She had spent months studying successful community development models from around the world, consulting with sociologists, economists, and policy experts to ensure their approach would be both meaningful and effective. The decision to announce their initiative through a quiet, personal message rather than a grand press conference had been deliberate. They wanted to signal from the very beginning that this was about substance rather than spectacle. The message would be delivered through a carefully produced video that would be released simultaneously across multiple platforms, ensuring it reached people where they already were rather than expecting them to seek it out. In the video, William and Catherine would speak directly to the camera, sitting not in a palace drawing room, but in their own kitchen at Anmer Hall, with their children's artwork visible on the refrigerator behind them. The setting was meant to emphasize their roles as parents and partners first, royal figures second. They would explain their decision in simple, honest language, acknowledging both their privileged position and their genuine desire to use that privilege in service of meaningful change. The announcement would reveal that over the next 5 years, they would spend extended periods living in different communities across the UK, from post-industrial towns in the north to rural farming communities in Scotland, from struggling seaside towns to diverse inner-city neighborhoods in London. During each residency, they would work directly with local organizations, attend community meetings, send their children to local schools, and shop at local businesses. Most significantly, they would document their experiences not through traditional royal reporting, but through a transparent, ongoing dialogue with the public. They would maintain a regular online presence, sharing both successes and failures, asking for input and feedback, and creating space for honest conversations about the challenges facing modern Britain. The potential risks were enormous. By making themselves more accessible and accountable, they were opening themselves to criticism and scrutiny in ways that previous generations of royals had carefully avoided. They would face questions about their effectiveness, their motivations, and their right to involve themselves so directly in local affairs. Some would undoubtedly see their efforts as publicity stunts or misguided charity work. But Catherine and William had decided that these risks were worth taking. They had watched as younger generations became increasingly disconnected from traditional institutions, including the monarchy. They had seen how social media had changed the nature of public discourse, making transparency and authenticity more valuable than carefully managed public relations. They understood that the monarchy's future relevance depended on its ability to demonstrate real value in people's daily lives. The morning of the announcement, Catherine felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement that reminded her of her wedding day more than a decade earlier. Like that day, she was about to embark on something that would fundamentally change her life and her role in British society. Unlike that day, however, she felt fully prepared for the challenges ahead. As she and William made their final preparations for the video recording, Catherine thought about the conversation she had been having with their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been told about the family's new direction, and their responses had been both enlightening and encouraging. Charlotte had asked whether they would still be princes and princesses if they lived in regular houses sometimes. George had wondered whether he would make friends at the different schools they would attend. Louis had simply wanted to know if their new houses would have good gardens for playing football. Their children's practical, uncomplicated perspective on the changes had reinforced Catherine's belief that this initiative was the right choice for their family. Rather than growing up isolated within the bubble of royal privilege, George, Charlotte, and Louis would experience firsthand the diversity and richness of British society. They would understand from an early age that their future roles as potential monarchs meant serving people from all backgrounds and circumstances. The video recording itself would be intimate and conversational. William and Catherine had decided against using a formal script, choosing instead to speak from outline notes that allowed for natural, spontaneous dialogue. They wanted viewers to see them as real people making a real commitment, not as royal figures delivering carefully crafted propaganda. As the camera began rolling, Catherine felt a sense of calm settle over her. The decision had been made, the preparations were complete, and now it was time to trust in the wisdom of their choice. She looked at William, seeing in his expression the same mixture of determination and hope that she felt herself. Together, they began to speak, their words carrying across the nation and around the world, marking the beginning of a new chapter not just for their family, but for the British monarchy itself. The quiet power of their message would not come from its volume or its grandiosity, but from its sincerity and its practical implications. In a world increasingly skeptical of institutions and authority figures, William and Catherine were offering something rare: genuine accountability, real accessibility, and honest engagement with the challenges facing ordinary people. As they spoke into the camera that morning, the nation truly would hold its breath, waiting to see whether this royal couple could deliver on the ambitious promises they were making. The success or failure of their initiative would be measured not in media coverage or public approval ratings, but in the concrete improvements they could help bring about in the communities they would call home. The announcement represented more than just a change in royal protocol. It was a reimagining of what leadership could look like in the 21st century. By choosing to lead through service, listening, and shared experience rather than through ceremony and distance, William and Catherine are betting their future relevance on their ability to prove that privilege could be transformed into genuine public good. The message they were about to deliver would resonate far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom, inspiring discussions about leadership, service, and social responsibility in capitals around the world. But for Catherine, as she sat in her kitchen that morning, preparing to address her fellow citizens, the most important audience was much smaller and much more personal. The single mothers, the homeless young men, the struggling families who had shared their stories and trusted her to listen. Their quiet, powerful message was ultimately a promise to those individuals and countless others like them, that their voices had been heard, their struggles had been witnessed, and their hope for a better future would be met with serious, sustained, and meaningful action. The video had been live for exactly 4 hours when Rebecca Martinez, a communications director at Buckingham Palace, realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in royal history. Her phone buzzed continuously with notifications as social media platforms struggled to keep up with the volume of responses pouring in from across the globe. The hashtag Royal Promise was trending in 17 countries, and the video itself had already been viewed 12 million times. But the numbers told only part of the story. Rebecca had been monitoring royal communications for 8 years, and she had never seen responses like these. Instead of the usual mixture of polite approval and respectful criticism that typically followed royal announcements, the comment sections were filled with personal stories, detailed suggestions, and genuine questions about how ordinary citizens could become involved in the initiative. Margaret Thompson, a 73-year-old retired teacher from Hull, had written a 3-paragraph response describing her town's struggles with youth unemployment and asking whether William and Catherine might consider Hull as one of their community residencies. Her comment had received over 8,000 likes and hundreds of replies from other Hull residents offering additional information and support. Meanwhile, in a cramped apartment above a fish and chips shop in Blackpool, Danny Williams was reading the royal announcement for the 3rd time. Danny had been out of work for 18 months since the hotel where he worked as a maintenance supervisor had closed permanently following the pandemic. His wife, Emma, was working 2 part-time jobs to keep their family afloat while their teenage daughter, Chloe, was starting to talk about dropping out of school to help with expenses. Danny's initial reaction to seeing Royal's promise to live among regular people had been skeptical even cynical. He had seen too many politicians and celebrities make grand gestures that ultimately amounted to nothing more than photo opportunities. But something about the way William and Catherine had spoken in their kitchen, with their children's drawings visible behind them, had given him pause. They mentioned Blackpool specifically, Emma said, looking up from her own phone where she had been watching the video. They said they want to understand how coastal towns are adapting to economic changes. Chloe, who had been pretending not to listen while doing homework at the kitchen table, finally spoke up. Do you think they'll actually come here? Like really live here? Danny shrugged, but Emma could see something shifting in his expression. Even if they do, he said slowly, what difference would it make? It was exactly the kind of question that Catherine had anticipated when she and William were planning their announcement. They knew that years of broken promises from various institutions had left many communities deeply skeptical about outsiders offering help, even well-intentioned outsiders. Earning genuine trust would require more than good intentions. It would require consistent action and visible results. The challenge of transforming skepticism into partnership was already becoming apparent in the responses pouring into the Palace Communications Center. Alongside expressions of support and curiosity, there were pointed questions about accountability, specific timelines, and measurable outcomes. These weren't hostile challenges, but rather the thoughtful inquiries of people who had learned to be cautious about promises that sounded too good to be true. Dr. James Morrison, a sociology professor at the University of Manchester, was among those offering detailed feedback through the official response channels that had been established alongside the video announcement. His message outlined both the potential benefits and the likely obstacles that William and Catherine would face as they attempted to integrate into existing community structures. The success of this initiative, Dr. Morrison wrote, will depend largely on their willingness to follow rather than lead in the initial stages of each community residency. Local organizations and informal networks have their own dynamics and hierarchies that can't be understood quickly by outsiders, regardless of their good intentions or their royal status. His response included specific recommendations for how the royal couple might approach community integration, suggestions for measuring impact, and warnings about the risk of inadvertently disrupting effective local initiatives by drawing too much attention or resources away from established programs. These types of substantive, constructive responses were exactly what William and Catherine had hoped to generate. Rather than simply announcing their plans and expecting public approval, they had structured their initiative as an ongoing conversation with the communities they intended to serve. The announcement video had included specific information about how people could provide input, ask questions, and even suggest locations for future residencies. Within hours of the video's release, a dedicated website had received over 50,000 visits, with users submitting everything from formal proposals from local councils to handwritten letters from individual families. The diversity of responses reflected the broad cross-section of British society that felt both curious about and invested in the success of the royal initiative. Thomas Chun, a small business owner in Cardiff who ran a family restaurant, had submitted a video response describing how his community had been working to revitalize their high street following several years of shop closures. His message wasn't asking for royal intervention, but rather offering to share their experiences with community-led economic development. If their royal highnesses are serious about learning how communities solve problems, Thomas said into his phone camera, then they should hear about what we've been doing here without any outside help. This type of response particularly pleased Catherine when she reviewed the submissions later that evening. The initiative was designed not to position William and Catherine as saviors arriving to fix broken communities, but rather as students and partners learning from the innovative solutions that communities had already developed. The most successful community development work they had learned from their research typically came from within communities themselves rather than from external interventions. The announcement had also sparked conversations in unexpected places. In the House of Commons, members of Parliament from both major parties had begun discussing how the royal initiative might complement or conflict with existing government programs. While some MPs expressed private concerns about royals becoming too involved in political issues, others saw opportunities for productive collaboration. Sarah Blackwood, the Labour MP for a constituency in Birmingham that had been mentioned as a potential residency location, was already planning to reach out to palace officials about coordination with local government services. Her constituency included several neighborhoods that were dealing with complex challenges related to housing, employment, and social integration, and she was curious about how royal involvement might amplify or complicate the work already being done by local agencies. On the other side of the political spectrum, Conservative MP Richard Hayes was having similar thoughts about his own constituency in Cornwall. The fishing communities he represented had been struggling with economic uncertainty and changing regulations, and he wondered whether royal attention might help bring additional resources or simply create unrealistic expectations about quick solutions to long-standing problems. These political considerations were exactly the kinds of complexities that Catherine and William had spent months thinking through with constitutional experts and government liaisons. The initiative would need to navigate carefully between offering genuine support for community development and avoiding any actions that might be perceived as political interference or favoritism. The international response to the announcement was also noteworthy. News outlets from around the world had picked up the story, with many framing it as a potential model for how modern monarchies might adapt to changing social expectations. The Swedish and Dutch royal families, both of which had already implemented reforms aimed at modernizing their roles, were reportedly studying the British initiative with interest. More significantly, the announcement had inspired conversations about leadership and public service in countries without monarchies. Editorial writers in American newspapers were asking whether elected officials might learn from the royal couple's approach to community engagement. Similar discussions were taking place in Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations where the British royal family continued to hold official roles. Back in Britain, the immediate practical implications of the announcement were becoming clearer as palace staff began coordinating with local authorities in the communities that had been mentioned as potential residency locations. Each location would require significant security assessments, housing arrangements, and coordination with local schools and services. Detective Inspector Caroline Fletcher, who led the Royal Protection Unit for community visits, was already dealing with logistical challenges unlike any she had faced in her 15-year career. Traditional royal visits involved carefully controlled environments and predetermined schedules. Extended residencies would require security arrangements that allowed for genuine integration into community life while still maintaining appropriate levels of protection. The security considerations alone represented a dramatic departure from standard royal protocols. William and Catherine would need to attend community meetings, shop at local stores, take their children to local schools, and participate in neighborhood activities. Each of these routine activities would require security assessments and planning, but the protection measures couldn't be so intrusive that they prevented the natural community interactions that were essential to the initiative's success. As the first day of public response to the announcement drew to a close, Catherine found herself both energized and sobered by the reactions they had received. The enthusiasm and engagement from so many communities had exceeded even her optimistic expectations, but the thoughtful questions and constructive challenges had also reinforced how much work lay ahead. She spent the evening reading through hundreds of individual responses, taking notes on recurring themes and specific suggestions. Many people had shared personal stories about their communities, describing both the challenges they faced and the creative solutions they had developed. These stories would form the foundation for how she and William approached their first community residency. The response from young people had been particularly encouraging. University students, recent graduates, and teenagers had submitted some of the most detailed and innovative suggestions about how the royal initiative might evolve over time. Many of these young respondents had grown up with social media and were accustomed to interactive, transparent communication with public figures, and their feedback reflected expectations for ongoing dialogue rather than one-way announcements. Chloe Williams in Blackpool, who had wondered whether the royals would really come to her town, had spent the evening crafting her own response. With help from her parents, she had written a letter describing what it was like to be 17 in a seaside town where many of her friends were leaving for cities as soon as they finished school. Her letter wasn't a complaint, but rather a thoughtful analysis of why young people felt they had to leave and what might encourage them to stay. Her letter would be one of thousands that would influence how William and Catherine shaped their approach to community engagement. The quiet power of their announcement lay not in its immediate impact, but in its potential to create ongoing conversations between the royal family and the diverse communities they intended to serve. As Catherine turned off her computer that night, she felt confident that the first phase of their initiative had succeeded. They had opened a dialogue, demonstrated their serious commitment to meaningful engagement, and created platforms for the kind of two-way communication that would be essential for success. The hard work of proving that their promises could become reality would begin in just a few weeks when they took up residence in their first community. The nation was indeed holding its breath, but not in passive anticipation. Instead, communities across Britain were actively preparing to engage with this unprecedented experiment in royal service, ready to test whether centuries-old institutions could adapt to meet 21st century needs. 6 weeks after their announcement, William and Catherine stood outside a modest terraced house on Maple Street in Middlesbrough, their suitcases at their feet, and their children peering curiously through the car windows at what would be their home for the next 3 months. The house belonged to Janet and Michael Foster, a retired couple who had volunteered to host the royal family after seeing their announcement video. The choice of Middlesbrough for their first extended residency had been deliberate and, to many observers, surprising. The town in northeast England had faced significant economic challenges following the decline of its steel industry, and it rarely appeared in news coverage except when statistics about unemployment or social problems were being discussed. But Catherine and William had been drawn to Middlesbrough precisely because of these challenges and because of the innovative community responses they had discovered during their research phase. Janet Foster, a former school administrator, had been skeptical when local council representatives first approached her about hosting the royal family. "I told them they must have the wrong house," she later recounted to journalists. "Why would royalty want to stay in a two-up, two-down terrace when there are proper hotels in town?" But as the arrangements developed and Janet learned more about the initiative's goals, her skepticism had transformed into cautious optimism. She had lived in Middlesbrough for 47 years and had witnessed both its struggles and its resilience. If the royal couple genuinely wanted to understand how ordinary communities functioned, she decided, then they should see it all: the challenges and the triumphs, the problems and the solutions. The Foster house had been selected partly because of its location in the heart of a neighborhood that embodied many of the dynamics William and Catherine wanted to understand. Within a 3-block radius, there were families dealing with unemployment, elderly residents living alone, recent immigrants establishing new lives, young families struggling with housing costs, and small business owners working to revitalize the local economy. Michael Foster, who had worked as a foreman at the local steelworks before its closure 15 years earlier, had initially worried that having royalty in his house would create artificial changes in the neighborhood's daily routines. "I didn't want everyone acting different just because of who was staying here," he explained to his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a week before the royal family's arrival. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to the Fosters for 30 years, had her own concerns about the arrangement. "It's all well and good them wanting to see how we live," she said, "but what happens if our daily problems become their entertainment? We're not zoo animals." These concerns were exactly the kinds of issues that Catherine had spent considerable time thinking about during the weeks leading up to their first residency. The success of the entire initiative depended on their ability to integrate authentically into community life without turning that life into a spectacle or performance. It was a delicate balance that would require constant attention and adjustment. The security arrangements alone had required weeks of careful planning and community consultation. Detective Inspector Fletcher had worked closely with local police to develop protocols that would provide necessary protection while minimizing disruption to neighborhood routines. Rather than the obvious security presence that typically accompanied royal visits, the protection team would maintain a low profile, with officers positioned discreetly throughout the area. The most visible change to the neighborhood had been the installation of subtle security measures around the Foster house and the nearby streets. But even these modifications had been planned in consultation with residents, and several neighbors had volunteered to help coordinate parking and foot traffic to minimize inconvenience for elderly residents and families with young children. On their first morning in Middlesbrough, Catherine woke before dawn, partly due to nervousness and partly because the sounds outside her bedroom window were unfamiliar. Instead of the relative quiet of Kensington or Norfolk, she heard the rumble of early morning traffic, the distant sound of industrial activity, and the voices of neighbors heading to work. She dressed quietly and made her way downstairs to the small kitchen where Janet Foster was already preparing tea. "You're up early," Janet observed, glancing at the clock showing just past 6 in the morning. "I couldn't sleep," Catherine admitted. "I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong today." Janet studied her guest's face for a moment before responding. "You know what I think? I think you're worried about the wrong things. The real test isn't whether you make mistakes today. It's whether you learn from them and keep trying tomorrow." This conversation would prove to be more significant than either woman realized at the time. Janet's matter-of-fact perspective on the challenges ahead would become one of Catherine's most valuable resources during the residency. Over the following weeks, their early morning conversations in the Foster kitchen would help Catherine understand the rhythms and realities of community life in ways that formal briefings never could have achieved. William's integration into the community began with a visit to the local job center, where he had arranged to spend time observing the challenges faced by people seeking employment. His first morning there coincided with the visit of Tommy Richards, a 28-year-old former steelworker who had been unemployed for 8 months following the closure of another local manufacturing plant. Tommy's initial reaction to discovering that a royal prince was sitting in the job center was a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. "What's he doing here?" Tommy asked the center advisor, loud enough for William to hear. "Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" William's response would be remembered by everyone present as a pivotal moment in establishing his credibility within the community. Rather than offering a formal explanation or deferring to his security detail, William simply walked over to Tommy and introduced himself. "I'm here because I want to understand what people in this situation are going through," William said. "I've never had to look for work, and I've never worried about paying rent or buying food for my family. I know that makes me incredibly fortunate, but it also means I don't really understand what most people's lives are actually like." Tommy was taken aback by the directness of the response. He had expected royal platitudes or careful political language, not this kind of honest acknowledgement of privilege and ignorance. After a moment's hesitation, he found himself explaining his situation in detail. The plant closure, the competition for limited jobs, the financial pressures his family was facing, and his growing concern that his skills were becoming obsolete in a changing economy. William listened without interrupting, taking notes, and asking occasional questions that demonstrated genuine engagement rather than polite interest. When Tommy finished his explanation, William asked if he could shadow Tommy through some of his job-seeking activities over the following days to better understand the practical challenges of finding employment in the current economic environment. This conversation, which lasted nearly an hour, would become the foundation for William's understanding of unemployment in post-industrial communities. More importantly, it established a pattern of authentic engagement that would characterize his interactions throughout the residency. Rather than maintaining the careful distance that royal protocol typically required, William was positioning himself as a student rather than an expert, someone seeking to learn rather than someone offering solutions. The news of this job center interaction spread quickly through Middlesbrough, partly through social media posts by other visitors who had witnessed the conversation, and partly through the informal communication networks that existed in close-knit communities. By evening, the story had been shared dozens of times across local Facebook groups and community forums. But the response was more nuanced than simple excitement about royal attention. Many residents were taking a wait-and-see approach, interested to observe whether William's apparent sincerity would translate into sustained engagement and meaningful outcomes. The community had experienced disappointment before when outsiders had arrived with grand promises and short attention spans. Meanwhile, Catherine was navigating her own integration challenges. Her first week included visits to local schools, community centers, and small businesses, but she was also learning about community life through seemingly mundane activities like grocery shopping, walking to the post office, and waiting for buses. These routine activities provided insights that formal visits could never have offered. Standing in line at the local supermarket, Catherine overheard conversations about the challenges of managing household budgets, the impact of rising energy costs, and the creative strategies families were using to make their money stretch further. Waiting at the bus stop, she learned about the transportation challenges that made it difficult for people to access jobs in other parts of the region. Most significantly, these everyday interactions allowed Catherine to observe the informal support networks that existed within the community. She watched neighbors helping elderly residents with their shopping, teenagers volunteering to walk dogs for busy families, and small business owners extending credit to customers going through difficult times. These observations would later influence her understanding of how external interventions might support rather than disrupt existing community strengths. The royal children's integration into local schools have been one of the most carefully planned aspects of the residency. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been enrolled at nearby primary schools where they would attend regular classes alongside local children. The schools had been selected partly for their educational quality, but mainly for their representativeness of the educational challenges facing working-class communities. Charlotte's teacher, Mrs. Sarah Henderson, had been teaching for 23 years and had initially felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of having a royal child in her classroom. But Charlotte's natural curiosity and enthusiasm had quickly made her a popular classmate, and Mrs. Henderson found herself forgetting about her students' royal status as she focused on Charlotte's academic and social development. The other children in the class had shown remarkable adaptability in accepting their new royal classmate. After a few days of curiosity about whether Charlotte lived in a castle or wore a crown to bed, they had settled into treating her as simply another member of their class. This normalization was exactly what Catherine and William had hoped for, both for their children's development and as evidence of their successful integration into community life. The children's experiences at school also provided valuable insights for their parents about the educational challenges facing local families. Through homework assignments, school events, and conversations with teachers, Catherine and William learned about funding constraints, resource shortages, and the creative solutions that educators were implementing to provide quality education despite systemic challenges. By the end of their first month in Middlesbrough, the royal family had established routines that reflected genuine community integration rather than extended royal tourism. William had become a regular volunteer at the local food bank, where his initial awkwardness had gradually been replaced by genuine competence in tasks like inventory management and food preparation. Catherine had joined a local mothers group where she participated in discussions about parenting challenges, school policies, and community safety concerns. More importantly, they had begun to understand the complex interconnections between different community challenges. Unemployment wasn't just about individual job searches. It was connected to transportation systems, childcare availability, educational opportunities, and mental health support. Housing costs weren't just about individual affordability. They were connected to employment patterns, community investment, and government policy decisions. These interconnections had become apparent through their participation in community meetings, informal conversations with neighbors, and observations of daily life. The insights they were gaining would form the foundation for the practical recommendations they would eventually make about supporting community development and addressing systemic challenges. The national media had initially struggled to find compelling stories about the royal residency. Without dramatic events or crisis interventions, the The day-to-day reality of community integration didn't easily fit into traditional news formats. But gradually, journalists began to recognize that the significance of the initiative lay precisely in its ordinary nature, in the fact that royalty was choosing to experience and understand regular life rather than maintaining traditional distance and ceremony. As their second month in Middlesbrough began, Catherine and William were starting to see the first tangible impacts of their presence in the community. Their participation in local activities had drawn attention and resources to organizations that had previously struggled for recognition. The food bank where William volunteered had received increased donations and volunteer applications. The schools their children attended had gained visibility for their innovative programs and dedicated teachers. But they were also learning that sustainable impact would require more than just attention and resources. Real change would depend on their ability to help communities build lasting capacity for addressing their own challenges, rather than creating dependence on external support. This realization would shape the next phase of their residency and influence how they approached future community partnerships. 3 years after that first quiet announcement in their kitchen, Catherine stood in a packed community center in Glasgow, listening as Maura MacLeod, a local housing activist, presented a comprehensive plan for affordable housing development that had emerged directly from the collaborative work begun during the royal family's residency in the area 6 months earlier. The transformation was remarkable not just for its scope, but for how it had evolved from community leadership rather than royal intervention. The Glasgow residency had been their 7th extended community placement, and by then, Catherine and William had refined their approach considerably from those early, uncertain days in Middlesbrough. They had learned that their most valuable contribution wasn't in providing solutions, but in creating connections between community organizations, between local resources and external opportunities, and between innovative local ideas and wider networks that could help implement them. Moira's housing plan was a perfect example of this evolved approach. During their residency, Catherine had participated in regular tenant meetings where she had listened to residents describe the challenges they faced with substandard housing and exploitative landlords. Rather than promising royal intervention, Catherine had helped connect these residents with legal advocates, policy researchers, and successful housing cooperatives in other cities. William had worked with local business leaders and construction workers to understand the practical barriers to affordable housing development. Through his participation in trade union meetings and informal conversations at local pubs, he had learned about skilled workers who wanted to contribute to community development but lacked coordination and funding structures to make their expertise available for local projects. The breakthrough had come when Catherine suggested bringing together all the different groups: tenants, workers, advocates, researchers, and business owners for a series of collaborative planning sessions. Her role had been purely facilitative. She had used her position to convene meetings and ensure all voices were heard, but the ideas and solutions had emerged from the community participants themselves. The resulting housing plan was innovative, practical, and community-controlled. It proposed a cooperative development model that would provide affordable homes while also creating local employment opportunities and establishing ongoing community ownership of the housing stock. The plan had attracted attention from housing experts across Europe and had already received preliminary funding commitments from both government sources and private investors. Most significantly for Catherine, the plan would continue to develop and be implemented entirely through local leadership, with ongoing support from the networks that had been established during the residency, but without any need for continued royal involvement. This was exactly the kind of sustainable impact that she and William had hoped to achieve when they first announced their initiative. The success in Glasgow represented the culmination of lessons learned through 6 previous residencies, each of which had taught them something different about effective community engagement. In Blackpool, they had learned about the economic challenges facing coastal towns and the innovative ways that communities were adapting to changing tourism patterns. Danny Williams, the unemployed hotel worker they had met during their first week, had become a leader in developing a local skills-sharing network that matched experienced workers with young people seeking practical training. Their time in rural Cumbria had taught them about the specific challenges facing agricultural communities, including the impact of climate change on farming practices and the difficulties young people faced in continuing family farming operations. Through their work with local farmers, they had helped establish connections between traditional farming knowledge and agricultural research institutions, leading to pilot programs for sustainable farming techniques that were now being studied by universities across the UK. In inner-city Birmingham, they had focused on educational opportunities and youth development. Their children's attendance at local schools had given them deep insights into the resource challenges facing urban education, but also into the creative solutions that teachers and community organizations were implementing. Catherine's involvement with local parent groups had contributed to the development of a community education network that provided tutoring, mentoring, and cultural enrichment programs that supplemented formal school offerings. Each residency had followed a similar pattern of deep listening, relationship building, and collaborative problem solving, but the specific outcomes have been shaped entirely by local priorities and local leadership. William and Catherine had become skilled at identifying and amplifying existing community strengths rather than imposing external solutions. The cumulative impact of these residencies had extended far beyond the individual communities they had lived in. The publicity and attention generated by their presence had drawn national focus to issues like rural economic development, coastal town regeneration, urban education funding, and social housing policy. More importantly, the collaborative approaches they had helped develop were being adapted and implemented by communities across the country that had never hosted royal residencies. The initiative had also fundamentally changed William and Catherine themselves. Their children were now fluent in multiple regional accents and dialects, equally comfortable in rural farming communities and inner-city neighborhoods. George had developed a particular interest in engineering through his exposure to different industrial and agricultural environments. Charlotte had become passionate about education policy through her experiences in diverse school systems. Lewis had learned to play football with children from dozens of different backgrounds and had developed an intuitive understanding of social dynamics that would serve him well in his future royal role. For Catherine personally, the experience had deepened her understanding of both the potential and the limitations of privilege. She had learned that her royal status could open doors and create opportunities, but that lasting change required the sustained commitment and expertise of people who lived and worked in communities every day. Her role was to facilitate and amplify, not to lead or direct. This understanding had led to the most recent evolution of their initiative. Rather than continuing to focus primarily on their own residencies, they had begun working to establish permanent networks that could support community development work across the country. The Community Partnership Network they had launched 6 months earlier was designed to replicate the collaborative approaches they had developed, but without requiring royal participation. The network connected communities facing similar challenges, facilitated knowledge sharing between successful local initiatives, and helped match community projects with appropriate resources and expertise. It was staffed primarily by people they had met during their various residencies: community organizers, social workers, small business owners, educators, and activists who had demonstrated effectiveness in collaborative problem solving. William's role in the network focused on economic development and employment creation. His experiences working with job seekers, small business owners, and trade union members had given him insights into the practical barriers that prevented economic opportunities from reaching communities that needed them most. He had become particularly interested in supporting social enterprises, businesses that prioritize community benefit alongside financial sustainability. Through the network, William had helped establish connections between successful social enterprises in different regions, enabling them to share best practices and coordinate their efforts. He had also worked with financial institutions to develop lending programs specifically designed for community-controlled economic development projects. Catherine's contributions to the network centered on education and family support services. Her work with parent groups, teachers, and youth organizations had highlighted the ways that educational opportunities were connected to broader community health and economic development. She had become an advocate for integrated approaches to child and family development that addressed educational, health, and economic needs simultaneously. The network's family support programs provided resources for parents while also creating pathways for community members to develop skills in childcare, education support, and family advocacy. These programs were designed to strengthen communities' internal capacity to support their children and families rather than creating dependence on external services. As Catherine listened to Moira MacLeod present the Glasgow housing plan that evening, she reflected on how much had changed since that nervous morning when they had first announced their initiative. The skepticism they had initially encountered had largely been replaced by genuine partnerships and collaborative relationships. Communities no longer waited for royal visits to begin addressing their challenges. Instead, they were using the networks and approaches that had been developed to support their own ongoing development efforts. The media coverage of their work had also evolved significantly. Initially, journalists had struggled to find dramatic stories in the day-to-day reality of community development work. But over time, news outlets had begun to recognize the significance of the systemic changes that were emerging from the initiative. Feature articles now focused on specific policy changes, successful community projects, and innovative collaborative approaches rather than on the novelty of royals living in regular neighborhoods. International attention had led to inquiries from other countries interested in adapting similar approaches to their own contexts. Catherine and William had consulted with government officials, community organizations, and academic researchers from across Europe, North America, and the Commonwealth about how principles of community partnership might be applied in different political and cultural environments. But the most meaningful validation of their work continued to come from the communities themselves. Letters, emails, and social media messages from people they had worked with provided ongoing evidence that the collaborative relationships they had helped establish were continuing to generate positive outcomes long after the royal residencies had ended. Tommy Richards, the unemployed steelworker William had met at the job center in Middlesbrough during their first week, had recently been elected to the local council and was leading efforts to establish a regional manufacturing cooperative. Danny Williams from Blackpool had developed his skills-sharing network into a social enterprise that was now operating in 12 coastal towns across England and Wales. Charlotte's former teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had used insights from her experience with Royal Integration to develop teacher training programs focused on supporting children from diverse backgrounds. The programs were now being used by education authorities across the north of England. These individual success stories represented thousands of similar examples of how the initiative had helped people develop their own leadership capacity and create lasting positive changes in their communities. The quiet power of Catherine and William's original message had been proven not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through this accumulation of sustained, collaborative work that had strengthened communities' ability to address their own challenges. As the evening's presentation concluded and community members gathered for informal discussions about next steps, Catherine found herself in conversation with a group of young people who had been involved in various aspects of the housing project. They were discussing plans for expanding their work to include environmental sustainability, youth employment, and community arts programs. Listening to their enthusiasm and their sophisticated understanding of community development strategies, Catherine realized that the most important outcome of their initiative might not be the specific projects that had been completed, but rather the generation of young leaders who had learned collaborative approaches to social change and who would continue this work throughout their lives. The nation was no longer holding its breath in anticipation of what William and Catherine might accomplish. Instead, communities across the country were actively engaged in the ongoing work of collaborative development that the Royal Initiative had helped to model and support. The quiet power of their original message had been transformed into a sustained movement of community-controlled social change that would continue long after their own roles had evolved once again. As Catherine and William prepared for their next phase of work, focusing more on policy advocacy and international cooperation while maintaining support for the domestic community networks. They could see evidence everywhere of how their experiment in royal service had succeeded in ways that even they had not fully anticipated. The monarchy's relevance to 21st century Britain had been demonstrated not through ceremony or tradition, but through genuine partnership with citizens working to build stronger, more equitable communities. The quiet, powerful message they had delivered in their kitchen 3 years earlier had become a quiet, powerful movement that belonged not to them, but to the thousands of people who had chosen to participate in the collaborative work of social change.